So over the last 6 years, we should have learned an awful lot. Some of us have learned more than others. We all have a story to tell. And when I was asked to do this presentation, I thought, what would it be about? And I decided after 6 years, and I have 40 minutes to distill some of the most important aspects of what I've learned and what you should know. This presentation is designed to be the basic information that you should have. This seminar is about vaccine education, and many of you know an awful lot, but let me present some information to you. I might be able to fill some gaps. There were lots of people, of course, who came to Canberra to protest the policies of mandatory vaccination. And this wasn't publicized in the media at all. We're still suffering from censorship. That's why seminars like this are so important to get the message out. People like this, like Fauci and others, have been giving you information for the last 5 or 6 years. Just about all that information, I would say, I would classify as misinformation. The advice that we've been given has actually come from some of the top world policy makers, from Fauci to Joe Biden himself to the head of the CDC. Some of the statements are, when people are vaccinated, they are not going to get infected. That's wrong. We all now know that that's wrong. Joe Biden, you're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations. Wrong. That's wrong. And vaccinated people do not carry the virus and don't get sick. All those statements from the people who controlled world policy on COVID vaccination were clearly wrong. Let me, this is another person who helped develop the policy in Australia of mandatory vaccination. She's was a senior bureaucrat in Canberra, and she didn't even have a scientific degree. This is an important slide because it really explains much of what went wrong. You're asking yourself, how could we have gone so wrong? How could they have allowed the misinformation to be spread so wide? Why were the decisions so crazy? And there's an explanation for it. The COVID-19 vaccines were not classified in terms of their development as drugs. Let that sink in. They were classified as countermeasures, and they were developed under the total supervision of the U.S. Department of Defense. The usual rules regarding the testing of quality, safety, and efficacy did not apply. And that's the reason why we're seeing what we're seeing today. Let me give you an example. The COVID-19 vaccines, when they were first released by Pfizer and Moderna, were said to be based on 44,000 individuals, roughly, divided into two groups, placebo and active. We were told those vaccines were 95% effective. Most of the people just took the word of the government that that was the case. I'm giving you the facts. That result of 95% effective was not based on 44,000 individuals. It was based on 170 individuals. 162 of those people in the 44,000 developed symptoms of COVID, mild symptoms of COVID, not life-threatening, not severe enough to send you to hospital. They were symptoms like a common cold. 8 of those 44,000 were vaccinated, and they did not show those symptoms, or they did show the symptoms, and there were 8 of them. So you compare 162 to 8, that's where you get the 170. So the absolute efficacy is less than 1%, not 95%. It's actually 0.88%. The worst part of this was that this was not a secret. If you only looked, the information was actually there. This was a FDA press release, and look at the date. The date is the 11th of December, 2020. And what they said, they actually referred to the 170, but it went over the head of just about everybody. And they said, nor is there evidence that the vaccine prevents transmission of SARS-CoV-2 from person to person. There it is, from the horse's mouth, from the FDA, December 2020. We were told this was just a vaccine. This wasn't a vaccine. This was a form of gene therapy, in that you were being, the people that got these injections were being administered mRNA, which is genetic material. By any definition, this was gene therapy. And furthermore, it was experimental. There was no precedent for this platform, the mRNA vaccine. They did change the definition of a vaccine. The industry ran into some problems because, as we now know, if you're vaccinated with the COVID-19 vaccines, you still get COVID-19. In fact, there are studies that show the more highly vaccinated one is, the more chance there is to get COVID-19. I was in Parliament House the day this paper was released, and one of the authors was a participant in the presentations that we were giving, and the paper showed that from the original 44,000 patient study, if you really looked closely at the data, there were 3.7 times more cardiovascular deaths, that's heart attack and stroke, in the treatment group than the placebo group. And this was not reported by Pfizer. This was a real red flag. This should have been taken to the FDA and discussed. This was a real red flag, but this information was buried. This is another really important point, which many of you might know about. It's about the PCR testing, which was one of the greatest pieces of misinformation in this whole saga. Because the PCR test, as defined by the guy who won the Nobel Prize for inventing the PCR test, said it wasn't diagnostic for disease, especially at the cycle threshold rates that they were applying. They were cranking up the sensitivity of the PCR test to get positive results. And they should never have done that. It was not diagnostic for disease. They were calling people infected when they were not sick, and they were not going to get sick. One of the other great pieces of misinformation is the origin of the virus. And of course, there's been some of that in the news in recent times, but there's been a whistleblower from the CIA itself who's now come out and said that the CIA was under great pressure not to admit that the SARS-CoV-2 virus came from the Wuhan lab. But that is now public knowledge. You should also know that APRA, the regulator of all health professionals in this country, wrote a letter to all health professionals, whether they be GPs or physiotherapists or dentists or whatever. This is part of their letter to doctors that basically said, if you do not follow the narrative and the policy of the government, we will chase you down and we may take away your license to practice. That is why when you asked an opinion of your doctor, your GP, about this vaccination, this injection, they could not tell you the truth if they knew it. Some of them didn't know it, but those that did know it weren't even allowed to tell you what their opinion was. Another thing which is really interesting that shocked me was that when I worked in multinationals as a staffer in medical departments, I was never allowed to use one word, and that word was safe. It was actually against the law to claim that any therapeutic was safe. And it's reasonable because all drugs have risks and benefits. No drug is safe. And I was absolutely astounded when I heard that they were calling these things safe. And I mentioned that to a lawyer that I was working with at the time one of the many cases that I've been involved with. And he said, oh, well, they just changed the law. And I said, what? He said, yeah, look it up. And I did. And they actually did. They actually changed the law to exempt COVID-19 vaccines so that they could be called safe. Here's another bombshell. This is Professor Plotkin. Professor Plotkin is sort of similar, you know, the Gray's Anatomy book, you might not know it, but the Gray's Anatomy is the Bible of doctors around the world, right? There is a one volume that says it all, that's constantly referred to by every doctor. Well, this guy, Plotkin, is the godfather of vaccinology, and he wrote the equivalent to Gray's Anatomy. Everyone referred to this guy. And he was testifying under oath in the US in a congressional hearing, and he had to admit that no vaccine has ever been studied long-term against a true placebo. Let that sink in. No vaccine has ever been studied long-term against a true placebo. So there's huge problems here. Now, I come to the next slide, which really is the basis for a lot of the problems that we're facing, in my opinion. And that is, in 2018, the Australian government introduced provisional approval of drugs. Now, a lot of doctors don't know what provisional approval means. The mainstream news media wouldn't have told you. I appeared in court once in a family court matter, and this was after an hour and a half of debate with me sitting outside the court, with the lawyers debating whether or not the court wanted to hear the science. They obviously didn't want to hear the science. But I got to testify, and the first question was from the barrister on the other side, Dr. Altman, don't you agree the COVID-19 vaccines were approved by the TGA? And I said, no. And the lady barrister looked at me and she said, no? Did you say no? And I said, no, because they were only provisionally approved, and there's a huge difference. And with that, I was dismissed from the court. They did not want to hear it, because provisional approval means the drug has not been subjected to the usual safety and efficacy criteria and guidelines in testing. People didn't know that. They were saying that they were approved. At the same time that the government in 2018 introduced provisional approval, they introduced what they call the Black Triangle Scheme. Who knows? Raise your hand if you've ever heard of the Black Triangle Scheme. A smattering of people. You've never heard of it? Most doctors have never heard of it. The Black Triangle Scheme. It's not the black triangle on the upper right. It's the black triangle on the lower right. And it's a little symbol that they introduced to alert doctors, to tell them, be careful. We want you to report every single adverse event reported to you by patients or family members. Even if it's been reported before, it's your obligation to do it. And this made sense to me at the time. Because if you're going to introduce a provisional approval system and you don't have the full data set of safety, you need physicians to report adverse drug events as they occur in the real world, where it's used by millions of people. It made sense. But did they tell doctors about the black triangle scheme? I personally have not seen any effort on the part of the regulators to advise doctors about the black triangle scheme. And I bet if you go and see your GP and you ask them what does the black triangle mean, they wouldn't know. Let me just fill you in. On the right-hand side, don't strain to try and read that, but there is one document that all doctors must read in order to safely and efficiently prescribe any medicine, and that is called the product information. It's a special document, capital P, capital I, product information. It's usually 20, 50 pages long, fine print. Do doctors read this? Not really. The dosage is usually at the end of the document. That's the way it's always been done. But with these vaccines, the dosage was brought at the front of the document, and you can see that the TGA warned doctors that the safety was not fully evaluated. How do you know? You can look. You see the little tiny black triangle on that page? That's all they saw. You think they took notice of that black triangle? No. This is interesting too. This is the plasmid, that is a circular bit of DNA that was used in the manufacture of the COVID vaccines for Moderna and Pfizer. DNA is toxic. If you use it in manufacture, you have to clean it up before the final product is made. The scale-up manufacture and sub-manufacture of these vaccines was really very poorly done. It was done by a lot of people, a lot of subcontractors in record time, and they cut corners. One of the most famous genomic experts in the world, Kevin McKernan, has said the impurities of the DNA is dangerous and can cause cancer. The TGA responded, and they put out a little blurb saying, no, we've analyzed the vaccine vials and there's nothing to worry about. Unfortunately, they didn't assay it correctly according to Kevin McKernan. And he says the cancers that are on the rise throughout the world are based, at least in part, due to this problem. Now, when something like this hits Time magazine, they're usually the last ones to know, right? But even they are saying, wow, there's an increase in cancers throughout the world that only occurred following the introduction of the COVID vaccines, but we don't have a clue as to why the cancers are on the rise. Kevin McKernan would disagree. The TGA stick to the claim that only 14 people have died due to the vaccines. In actual fact, over 1,000 people have been reported to have died due to the vaccines. And when you apply the usually accepted underreporting figure of 1 to 2%, we are looking at Australian deaths of 50 to 100,000 people. This is really quite serious. 35 people died on the same day. The otherwise healthy people died on the same day of their vaccination. And it is reported that none of them have been followed up in any credible way. So those 35 aren't even included in the 14. The chances of that happening is so close to zero, it doesn't matter. We knew the New South Wales hospital system recorded very, very well the number of people going to hospital who were vaccinated and unvaccinated until the end of 2022, when it looked like, you don't have to read these figures, but it looked like the overwhelming number of people in hospital were vaccinated. And the more you were vaccinated, the more chance you went to ICU or hospital. So what did the government in New South Wales do? What do you do if you're in government? You stop publishing the data. This is the data from the US. This is current. 39,000 reported deaths in the US. Underreporting factor of 1 to 2%, you're well over 1 million deaths. This is serious. There's been nothing like this before in history. It's easy to look at epidemiology and compare those that are vaccinated versus those that are unvaccinated and look at the death rates. They just don't want to do it. Prior to COVID, some vaccines were withdrawn with as few as 10 deaths. 10. A lot of drugs were withdrawn with 50 or 100 deaths. That was usually the benchmark. When there were red flags reported to drug agencies for a new drug and they were reported as 50 or 100 deaths, it warranted an investigation. In the US, there's 39,000. Senator Ron Johnson, I don't know if you've seen him in recent times, he's uncovering why the US FDA is not claiming any more than 10 child deaths. It's outrageous. It needs an investigation. So in 1976, the swine flu virus killed, I say 32 people there. Sometimes it's reported as 50 people, but they withdrew that vaccine. It looks like, to me at least, that these COVID vaccines should never have been released. And they're still being given to people, and that should not be happening. This is, you don't have to read the details of this slide, but I'm just trying to make the point here that the scale-up manufacture of these COVID-19 vaccines was done so poorly, and the formulation was so complicated. I've never seen a more complicated pharmaceutical formulation in my life. And this was done in record time. It usually takes 8 to 10 years to develop a vaccine. If you look at the data very closely, if you know where to look, you can see that most of the serious adverse events and deaths are concentrated within 5 or 10% of the batches. The other 95 or 90% of the batches were suboptimal, subtherapeutic. The people weren't getting the full dose. Good luck to them. That's another problem. The claim that the industry still hangs on, this is their claim. We're all seeing amongst our friends, our family, the damage that's being done. It's in your face. You can see it with your own eyes. Yet the industry and the government still refer to between 3 and 20 million lives saved. This has been debunked so many times. It was based on modeling of mythical numbers. They assumed that the vaccine was really effective in preventing transmission, really effective in preventing serious adverse effects. They made so many assumptions that were not true. And they came up with this mythical number of 20 million lives saved. It doesn't have any credibility at all. I'll just turn my attention to the other vaccines in general. There's been a lot of discussion about this in recent times, and I'll just conclude with this, that there's been about 12 studies, various quality from time to time, that compared vaxxed to unvaxxed kids with childhood vaccines, not COVID vaccines. They all, to some degree, agree that unvaccinated kids are healthier. But there's one study that stands out a mile, and that is the inconvenient study that was done in the Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit. And it was released just recently. And it was well designed, based on 20,000 kids, roughly 18,000 vaccinated, 2,000 unvaccinated, and the results were astounding. It was the best quality study of its type ever to see the light of day. They tried to suppress it. It got out. They even made a documentary. If you haven't seen the documentary, I urge you to see it. It's called An Inconvenient Study. So I'll just conclude. The evidence is overwhelming. It is everywhere. You cannot ignore it. I'm just presenting to you the facts. And you might say, COVID is over. Not really, because this could happen again with another pandemic. If you understand the principles, if you understand where to look for information, you'll be vaccine educated, and you'll be able to make up your own mind. You'll be able to have an informed decision, because I tell you what, you can't depend on your doctor to give you informed consent. Thank you for listening.